First of all, idea of retaking Calais, great idea. Second of all, you mentioned about universities and how they're not teaching us to think about the hard questions, which, as someone who's gone to university, I've found to be completely true. The only question I ask is that you suggested combating that in some way, but how are people who perhaps don't conform to the narrative supposed to do that when we're not given a platform to do so?
Yeah.
Pretty much shut down the second we even suggest we might be thinking differently.
I know.
And when we're up against what's essentially become more or less a religious cult, in that it's such a accepted thing on campus that it's almost like Christianity a couple hundred years ago in Europe, where everyone knows it to be true, and to step away from it is like kind of fun.
Yes, I think that's a really good way of putting it. I think certain values have been sacralized. They are treated as religious truths, in the sense that when somebody dissents, the expected response to the dissent is anger and rejection rather than reason and engagement. I suppose you could argue that this is not new. I mean, if you go back a couple of hundred years, universities, while thinking of themselves as centers of reason and logic and the Enlightenment, managed in many cases to maintain a religious test, to keep you out if you didn't sign up to whatever the religion of that country was. And they pulled this double think off. Some of them felt uncomfortable about it, but others went ahead with it. And I think they're doing something very similar now. But of course, the religion is the identity politics. It's the grievance politics, the wokeness, and all the rest of it, rather than actual religion. But if you look at the way in which student protesters work themselves up before a heretical speaker arrives on campus, I think any anthropologist would see it as a religious thing. The chanting, the shared rituals, what Durkheim would call the communal frenzy, right? It's not about I disagree with your position on immigration, or I disagree with your position on multiculturalism. It is about you are an evil, diabolical presence, and for the sake of our collective purity, we need to get rid of you. Now, of course, this is not a completely new phenomenon, right? People at that age can be remarkably intolerant, and that's always true. What I think is new and very sudden has been the combination of that zealotry with this very ugly and unattractive self-pity. So I'll tell you, when I first noticed this, I was at Oriel College, Oxford, which is where the statue of Cecil Rhodes is. Okay, so the overture of this whole thing in Britain was the Rhodes must fall movement some 5 or 6 years ago. I say a statue of Cecil Rhodes. I mean, it's a little guano-encrusted mannequin about this high in a niche so high up that you have to really twist your head to see the thing that you're determined to be offended by. But what was fascinating, I could imagine a group of lefty students in the 60s or the 70s or the 80s or the 90s saying, tear down the evil colonialist. What was new, and what I think would not have happened until this generation, was the internalization of the complaint. I feel violated every time I have to walk past it. I feel unsafe on a campus where this is. That is absolutely new. And it's what, there's a wonderful book by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff called The Coddling of the American Mind, which is about this, what they call this fragility. And they make the point that if you look at the vocabulary that we associate with it, safe spaces, trigger warnings, cultural appropriations, microaggressions, none of these phrases existed before 2015. Right? We've gone very, very suddenly, we've lurched into this position of constant grievance, constant woundedness. And Lukianoff makes the argument, I think, incredibly convincingly, that quite apart from being bad for everybody else, because none of us wants to be in a situation where people are waiting to pounce on any loose word in order to be angry, it's very bad for the people who are encouraged to take offense, because it's almost... Lukianoff is a great believer in in what he called, in cognitive behavioral therapy, a way that you treat some psychological problems by taking control of the situation assertively. And he says, if you were doing the opposite, if you could do a sort of anti-CBT, it would be this woke ideology that encourages everyone to see everything as directed at them. And he argues, I think fairly convincingly, that the rise in mental health problems on campus correlates pretty exactly to this new way of looking at the world. I think it's not even only on campus. You know, I have a child who's going to start school in September, so I've been looking at schools. And in almost every one, there is a prominently displayed notice on the board that says bullying policy or anti-bullying policy, anti presumably, and almost always they say the same thing, which is, you know, bullying is any kind of behaviour or action that causes offence to someone. Really? Really? And what if eating a cheese sandwich causes offence to someone? Right? And the mistake we're making, the fatal mistake we're making, is we are encouraging people to lose the sense of volition, of agency, right? I think all of you would understand intuitively the difference between me bumping into you by mistake and you falling over, and me pushing you. Even if the effect were the same, it's a hugely different circumstance, right? But if you're encouraged, from the moment you go to school age 4, to see anything you don't like as a kind of violence against you, how do we expect you to react the first time you are confronted with opinions that you really find difficult as an undergraduate? You know, and I think this is an incredibly dangerous thing for the kids themselves. In my former university, I saw the law students, law undergraduates, were being given trigger warnings before they had to read about disturbing cases. I mean, who would employ a lawyer from that generation, right? And there is going to be a moment, and you hear it already, where employers are saying, oh, if I let anyone of that age in, it's going to be endless litigation, constant complaints, you know, better off without them. And so I think this is, I think you'll have picked up, I'm generally optimistic about the state of the country, about the state of the world. But this deeply corrosive anti-enlightenment ideology on campus is the single biggest worry we have, because it undoes the basis of what keeps our society